Hello, welcome to Z Marie Design. Let's create typing paper foundation piecing blocks. This is what we will create today. So let's get started. This is a list of supplies that you will need. And I start by gathering in my color palette of choice all of my upcycled quilt binding strips that I have pressed open. These are cut at 2.5 inches to 3.5 inches wide. So I start by prepping my just standard size typing paper, 8.5 by 11. Beginning at the bottom corner, I fold the bottom edge up to meet the side edge of the paper, and then I put a crease. Just finger crease that. Then I'm going to cut off the remaining strip. The strip that I'm cutting off measures 8.5 by 2.5 inches. Now what we are left with is a square that measures 8.5 by 8.5, and that is what we will use for our foundation piece. So since it's already creased in the center, I'm going to grab the first fabric that I want for my center fabric. I'm going to lay it right sides up, right along the center of my crease on my paper, making sure that I have a little bit of overhang of fabric on either side of my paper. And I'm going to lay my strips on the diagonal. So I'm going to randomly select another piece of fabric. Now feel free to color coordinate these strips if you like. One color one side, one color the other. I'm just selecting randomly from my color palette. And then I will lay my second strip right sides up onto my first strip, pinning it in place, and then I will sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now when I sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance, make sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end, and make sure to shorten your stitch length. I've shortened my stitch length to 2.0. That'll make it easier for us to remove the paper once the paper is all covered with our fabric strips. I'm also using a 90-14 quilting needle. Now that I've sewn my 1/4 inch seam allowance, you can see where the paper is perforating already. I'm going to cut off that excess that's hanging over. I'll save that small piece because as you continue to fill your paper, you'll use shorter strips. So in between each strip that I sew, I'm going to press with a dry iron. And then I will continue to randomly select my strips, right sides facing, pinning it in place, sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and pressing, and I'll do that until the entire piece of my paper on both sides is completely filled. So this is what it will look like when your paper is all filled, and you can see how the paper is perforating from the stitches. Now if you have a small little piece that's left at the end of your paper, you don't have to cover that. I'll cover it, it'll be caught in the seam allowance, but feel free to add a little piece if you like. I'm not going to do that. Next I'm going to trim my fabric block using my paper 8.5 by 8.5 paper block as my guide. I'm going to trim it with my rotary cutter and my ruler. This is what it looks like before you trim it, and this is what it looks like after you trim it. So continue to make your blocks for the amount of blocks that you'll need for the project. I'll show you some projects at the end of the video. So next, let's remove our paper. So since we've used that shortened stitch length, and that 90-14 needle, it's perforated the paper enough that it makes it easier for us to tear it away. And making sure, that's why you backstitch at the beginning and the end, so that you don't pop your stitches when you're taking your paper out. You see I just finger press it over just to make sure that I can get a good tear away. And just continue to tear away your paper until you've torn it all away. So after you've torn away all of your paper, you might have some little pieces that are left. If your project is meant to be washed, that'll come out in the wash. Otherwise, you could also use some tweezers to pick those little pieces out. So this is what we will be left with. These are our blocks. Now, once your foundation paper pieces are all done, you can turn these and orient these in any direction that you like to create your block. I'm going to turn these to orient them to create a diamond shape. You can see my diamond shape that is coming together in the center. And then I'm going to sew my blocks together, right sides facing, pinning them in place. And just be careful when you're pinning your blocks because some of these are on the cross grain and some may even be on the bias. But I sewed a 1/4 inch seam allowance and now I'm pressing those seams to one side. And I will continue doing this and then I will sew those rows together. Now when I sew my rows together, I'm going to make sure to match up those seams. I will put a pin in one side of the seam, making sure that it comes out the other side of the seam, and then pin in place. And once again, just be really careful because some of these might be a little stretchy. You don't want to stretch your blocks out of shape. You can use quite a few pins if your blocks are a bit more stretchy. So a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you will press that seam to one side. And you will continue doing this until you have the blocks that you need to complete your project. So this is what my 4 blocks looks like. Now when I did this, I didn't get that diamond pattern that I wanted. So I ended up unpicking that and then re-sewing it to get that diamond pattern in the center. And I'm going to create a boho bag, and this is my boho bag pattern. That'll be my lining fabric, that floral, and this will be the outer fabric of my boho bag pattern. That's what I'm going to use with my 4 blocks that I've sewn. And so I created 8 blocks, 4 for the front part of the bag and 4 for the back part of the bag. And I will just continue piecing my binding strips together until I have my bag complete. If you want to know how to make this bag, just leave me a comment in the comment, and I will upload another video. So this is what I created with my foundation typing paper piece blocks. This is my boho bag. That's the front. You see, I like how I did the diamond shape there on both sides. And then I'll show you some other projects that I created using this same method. It's a great way to use up your scraps. You can cut your strips anywhere from 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 inch strips to cover your typing paper. And I also upcycled my typing paper. So this is another one of the quilts that I created, and I just used some sashing in between my blocks, but I orientated those blocks to have those diamond shapes. This is another quilt that I created using this exact same method, just putting the sashing in between each of the blocks. And then this is another project that I created with an after-school group, and they color coordinated their strips. Some just did them on the diagonal, pink on one side, green on another. You see, and some others that they did it where the diamond shape was in the center, turquoise and such. So I hope you like this project, and I hope you give it a try. Thanks for watching.